Hello there and welcome back to Bloodborne. Last time we made our way through the forsaken Canehurst Castle and happened upon the Covenant of the Vilebloods, led by their immortal queen, Annalise. And though we joined and left off with the promise of obeying our queen's orders and hunting others for their blood dregs, that's not going to be possible, unfortunately. Due to how invasion mechanics are designed, it can be difficult to invade other players in this game even when there's a high player population. And at this point in the game's life cycle, especially with the recent release of Dark Souls 3, that player population is fairly low, so we'll have to wait until a few certain areas later on where it's easy to invade. So in the meantime, we'll continue along with progress here. The badge we obtained from Annalise allows us to purchase a few new weapons, extra copies of the Rider Pelash, as well as the new Chikage, the resident katana of this game. The badge also allows for the purchase of extra copies of the Evelyn, as well as the Canehurst armor, which is incredibly expensive, so we'll be putting off purchasing that armor for a fair while. Let's test this thing out. Oh yeah, that's what you call a katana. And as the description mentioned, it bites into its wearer's essence, which means that it drains your HP while it's transformed. You can think of it like a tax on the transform moveset. As to whether it's a fair one, well, you'll have to decide for yourself. But for this thing to be any useful, we'll have to upgrade it, of course. I can't be the only one that enjoys that metallic doosh noise when you upgrade weapons, can I? At any rate, let's slot in some good blood gems into this thing as well, since those are just as important, if not more so, than upgrades, for making your weapon actually damaging. For whatever reason, physical attack up gems increase blood damage, despite there also being blood gems specifically for increasing blood damage. For this third gem here, we could opt with a rapid poison boosting one instead of a physical damage boosting one. Since the Chikage naturally has a rapid poison element to it, this could actually be useful, but at the end of the day, higher damage is going to be better for the vast majority of enemies, especially since not too many enemies can be rapid poisoned. Oh, and by the by, we'll also be using the repeater pistol again. It'll come in especially handy for this upcoming area in one particular instance. You'll get to see what that is later.
Welcome home, good hunter. I must have drifted off. What is it you desire? Very well. Let the echoes become your strength. Let me stand close. Now shut your eyes.
At this point, we could increase our skill or blood tinge to increase the Chikage's damage, although upping blood tinge does not show a damage increase on this page here. More into why that is a bit later. But we'll be putting points into Arcane so we can use those executioner gloves we obtained in Canehurst.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.
The gloves can also come in quite handy in the upcoming area, in the same spot as the repeater pistol will. So let's get going then. We won't actually be exploring Yaha Ghul, the unseen village. That way lies progress, and we still have a few optional bits we can check out. If you remember way back when we first explored the Forbidden Woods, we happened upon a house with a rather suspicious sounding man. He gave us a gift, us a special tonsil stone and told us that should we seek more power to help deal with all the difficulties around, that we should head for the chapel, and that the gift of the Godhead would grant us strength. In a rare moment of kindness, the game actually tells you all of that in the tonsil stone's description. In case you've forgotten. Appears useless but possesses some odd gravitational force that prevents its riddance. So, obviously the next logical step is to be grabbed by this hand here. I'm sure things will turn out wonderfully.
Oh, Amygdala! Oh, Amygdala! Have mercy on the poor bastard!
And so we're brought to the lecture building. What exactly that entails isn't clear yet, but probably not the best for us, given how we got here. Certainly doesn't look all that appetizing of a place to be in, that's for sure. Something that's worth noting, Souls veterans may actually recognize the voice of that man. If you are a Souls veteran and haven't, well, here's another chance to do so.
What a joy it is to behold the divine. It must be such a pleasure. You're in my debt, you know. You're nigh on a beast of the field. But here you are, treading a measure with the gods. Are your feet as fat as your wits? Oh, cease this dithering. Take the plunge. Throw yourself to the wolves. Are your
If you haven't yet realized who he is, and you're a veteran of the Souls games, well, I'll keep mum on his identity for a bit longer. It may be a bit more clear if we actually get a good look at his face. For now, let's explore this building here. Plenty of locked doors or doors that do not open from this side. A FromSoft tradition. Or staple, rather. We've also got the same wax-covered jars containing eyeballs that we espied in Bergenworth. Perhaps there's some connection between the two areas. There's a reason why there's a bunch of gravestones around here. If you haven't been upping your vitality much, then you could very easily die here. Otherwise, that guy isn't much of a threat. Quite a rude motherfucker though, that's for sure. Just jumping on a poor woman without even asking her permission, it's rude. Another connection to Bergenworth is this student uniform here. It's highly similar to the one that we picked up in Bergenworth. In fact, the only difference is the fact that it does not have a thick cape on it. Otherwise, it looks just as doofy. They couldn't have designed a better student uniform, something more fashionable. The main reason to come in here, though, is that lecture theater key. Today, the two-story lecture building is adrift in the nightmare, but once it was a place of reflection where scholars learned of history and archaeology. This is the second time that we've heard mention of a nightmare, the first time being that mysterious message after we killed Vom and appeared in the chapel in front of that spider-armed creature which told us to seek the Nightmare Newborn. It's clear that nightmares are of some importance here, but exactly what remains a mystery. Oh, and by the by, my memory of this area is a bit poor, so don't be surprised if I end up wandering back into a room and then finding nothing new. Open door to outside. Well, that's a fairly ominous looking door with that shadow coming from it. And a rather ominous prompt, so let's avoid going there for now. Oh, and remember what I just said about not remembering the layout of this level all that well? Here I mix this room up with a very similar looking one, and thus get confused about the ambush that it's talking about. This is the ambush that it's talking about. Fortunately, as we've already seen, these students aren't too threatening. Although given by their uniform, they seem more likely to be graduates, given the hat that they're wearing. Must have been one hell of a graduation party to end up like that, I gotta say. If this game had mimics, this would be a pretty good spot for one. As it is, it's just a regular chest like all the others, but we get a red jelly, which just from the item you wouldn't think would be too bad, but read the description and well, stillborn infants born of a creature of unknown origin, of the type found in some corners of the old labyrinth. It's a Chalice Dungeon ritual item, but that probably has to be one of the more grotesque items in the game, honestly. At any rate, here we finally get to use the lecture theater key, and here's where all these students are, waiting for their professor. Unfortunately, we're not their professor, and it seems that they're quite mad about that, so we're gonna have to do something about that. And that can be quite tricky because they have some absurd range with their melee attacks. You have a couple back there who are throwing around water, which stays around for quite a bit and is quite damaging in itself. You pretty much need just to take pot shots at them and whittle them down one by one. So if you try and rush in and take them all out at once, well, it can go good as you see here, but more likely than not you'll just get mobbed to death pretty quickly. Once you start to take them out though, it's pretty easy to finish the few stragglers off. It's worth noting that these guys are actually pretty good for farming because they give a decent amount of blood echoes, and they quite often drop quicksilver bullets, one of the main items you might be purchasing with blood echoes, making a kind of a two birds with one stone situation. Continuing on here, we get one of the more interesting items in the area. The Augur of Ebrietas. This is a hunter tool that we saw being used by Uriel, the Lost Scholar, the hunter that we fought in Bergenworth, and it can be used to partially summon Ebrietas. The initial encounter marked the start of an inquiry into the cosmos from within the old labyrinth, and led to the establishment of the choir. We'll be reading more about the choir later on, but for now, we're going to be putting this thing on our hotbar here, as it is one of the more useful hunter tools, as well as the executioner's gloves, which we did not put on before. This brings us back outside to the main hall of the building, so at this point we've explored pretty much every avenue here in the lecture hall. So let's go check out that one door we abandoned with the creepy shadow misting from it, and see where that leads. From one nightmare into another, welcome one and all to the Nightmare Frontier. Thankfully, they are kind enough to give you a lantern immediately, unlike our first visit to Yaha Ghul way back when we were kidnapped. And right away, you notice that something is different about this area compared to all others. Aside from the nightmarish geography, is the fact that there's that woman ringing a sinister bell. So I mentioned before that actually getting PvP in this game can be pretty difficult, and that's because in order to invade someone, they must have a bell-ringing woman in their world. Normally, such a woman only appears if they try to summon someone else to engage in jolly cooperation. But this nightmare here is one of the few areas in the game where there is a bell-ringing woman by default, and thus you can be invaded even if you're by your lonesome. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen in this video here. Also, by the by, one little detail about the geography here that I really enjoy is the fact that if you look closely, you can actually see that a number of the rocks scattered about like gravestones are actually bleeding, which is sufficiently nightmarish, I would say. We've seen some weird stuff already, what with those pale blue blobby things, as well as Rom the vacuous spider, but this area really takes it up a notch, and it's worth noting that you can actually potentially get here prior to seeing those things if you immediately take that tonsil stone, realize what to do with it, and well, go here. And right here we have a fairly interesting specimen. This is a large wandering nightmare, and these are the wandering nightmares that you want to focus on in this area. There are plenty of the smaller variants scattered about, but they only drop regular bloodstone shards, and so aren't particularly worth going after. But the large ones will drop large shards or even chunks. Oops, sorry, twin shards or even chunks, getting my upgrades confused with the Souls games. That right there is a pretty obvious shortcut that we won't be seeing the other end for quite some time. This area is quite large and is a pretty grueling gauntlet, as you'll come to see as we progress further. We can hear the bell ringing louder. She must be close. But before we can even begin to try and deal with her, we'll have to deal with this hunter here. This here hunter is a hunter of despair, so named by the guide. A poor hunter who found themselves here and cannot get out, so let's put them out of their misery. And a good thing we did so quickly too, as they're joined by another hunter of despair. Fighting them both at once can be tricky, but if you can manage to take out the first one by himself, then the second one goes down pretty easily. Well, so I say, but I do fairly poorly against him. Again, I'll blame that on my playing Dark Souls 3 more recently and being used to the specifics of the combat in that. It's nice to have excuses for poor play. You'll also notice that we get a blood drag from the previous hunter, and we'll get another one from this one when we kill him. That's due to the effect of the corruption oath rune that we equipped, that makes us a vile blood. So even if we cannot get much PvP, we can still get a few blood dregs here. I guess these guys are meant to simulate invasions, perhaps? Not entirely sure. So, as we've been doing when there's not much action going on, let's talk about the weapon that we've been using, the Chikage. It's an interesting weapon in that it's kind of an in-between the normal transforming weapons and the Tonitrus with its buff as opposed to transforming. Because although you do transform it and it does gain a new moveset, in appearance it's more like a buff rather than transforming it into a whole new weapon. It also changes the damage type as well, with the untransform moveset doing pure physical damage, and the transform moveset doing blood damage. Thus giving you two damage types with one weapon, which can come quite in handy. Looks like trouble up ahead. We'll have to proceed cautiously with all those dangerous looking enemies in front of us. Now we could just head directly into that old big swampy place with all the enemies, or we could head down this side path and see if we can't find something easier to do. Well, although certainly fearsome, these Lauren silver beasts here aren't too terribly threatening, and they can be pretty easily stun-locked to death. The only real thing of note about them is that they have pretty high physical defense. But even with the Chikage's modest physical damage, it's more than enough to take them out, and if you happen to have a source of elemental damage, especially fire, which they're especially weak to being beasts, they're not a threat at all. But here's where the actual difficult part comes in. We have a number of giant lost children strewn about the place. And they love to hurl boulders at you from a distance, and if you get pegged by one directly, it will almost certainly take you out in one shot. And even if you happen to just be hit by the debris as it shatters, you'll probably lose around half or most of your health. They're pretty damn threatening, especially if they happen to snipe you while you're fighting other enemies. That's why we didn't just head directly into that swamp there. That's the perfect situation for such a thing to occur. And here, the geometry kind of fucks up what I try to do, as I said. A boulder directly to the head is death, unfortunately. The geometry prevented me from getting the visceral attack I had intended, so... returning here, this is basically what things would have looked like had they not gone poorly. Visceral attacks are probably the best way to take these guys out. If you have a decent amount of skill, enough visceral attack damage, then you can take them out in one go, and they're pretty easy to stagger. At this point here, with that one giant lost child continuing to snipe at us with his boulders, we pretty much have to rush towards him. You can try and fight this low-end silver beast here, especially since they placed a nice stone pillar to block the boulders for you. But it's probably a better bet just to rush past and take out the lost child first, given that he's the primary threat here. These guys are trying to throw their boulders at you at close range. They're pretty vulnerable to being backstabbed, like so. If you can manage to get through this part of the level without too much difficulty, then you're pretty well set for the rest of it. This is probably one of the harder bits of the level, all things considered. Although, not the only difficult challenge that we'll have to contend with before we're through, that's for sure. Here we have another small wandering nightmare, but again, they're not really worth going after since all they drop is regular bloodstone shards. The far more valuable is this stone pillar that we can make crack and fall down, acting as a shortcut to the beginning of the level. And a very handy one too, because this next part here can be a bit of a pain in the ass. So it's nice to have this here. And here we have a large wandering nightmare who are pretty good at fending you off. They do a pretty good amount of damage as well as that knockback, which can make them pretty tricky to take out. But once you start attacking them, they pretty much fold instantly. Also, if you keep your eyes peeled very well, you may actually notice something interesting in this shot here. I'm not going to say what it is, you'll just have to use your eyes and try and figure that out, but it's pretty noticeable, and now it's gone. A fun little game of Wales Waldo. At this point, we have a number of paths we can tread upon, all leading to some pretty good treasure. And hey, we finally get a small wandering nightmare. But a lot of these paths end up involving drops, so let's not do this one just yet. Especially since if we head over this way, you'll notice many shiny objects. Turn back, what? Ah, this way to witness a miracle. Someone is trying to keep us from witnessing a magical miracle, so fire on them.
Lucky scamp! The gift of the Godhead cometh!
That dirty rat bastard, tricking us into thinking there was a miracle and then knocking us off a cliff. What an asshole. That said, this area is very well worth exploring, even if it is very treacherous, being nothing but a poisonous floored swamp. Because there's a lot of good items here. These guys here are crawlers with both small and large variants. There's actually a really interesting element to their design that I'm not going to point out just yet. But if you want to try and figure out what it is, look closely at them when they rear up and show their undersides, as that's where that element lies. As for actually fighting them, they're not too terribly threatening. They don't have all that much HP, and they're pretty slow to attack as well. Really, they're only even remotely a threat because they come in groups. As long as you take them out quickly though, they're not dangerous. So then, let's talk a bit more about the Chikage. First, the Untransform moveset. As a katana, the majority of its moveset is a variety of different types of slashing attacks with pretty decent range on them, but not excellent. Notably, its heavy attack is a pretty long distance thrust attack which can come in handy for taking out enemies at a distance, or taking down enemies weak to thrust damage. But easily the most notable feature of the Untransform moveset is its sheer raw speed. This thing's Untransform moveset is one of the quickest movesets in the game, if not the quickest, and boasts very powerful DPS versus anything that's not resistant to physical damage. Hey, wait a second. Do you hear that singing in the distance? Oh. I guess that must be what's singing. This here is a Winter Lantern, an enemy with a very interesting design and an incredibly annoying gimmick. Basically, they do two things. They cause a large amount of frenzy buildup just by being near them as long as you're within their line of sight, and they will try to grab you for a very large amount of damage, which will almost certainly take you out in one go, and even if it doesn't, the frenzy buildup will probably finish you off soon after. So, pretty much the best method to take them out is to just take them out immediately in one go, either with a powerful combo, such as the Chikage's transformed charged R2 into R2, or a visceral attack, as you can stagger their grab attempt, although obviously if you fail that, you're probably gonna die, so that's considerably more risky. That said, killing them does not go unrewarded, as in addition to the fact that they are typically placed guarding worthwhile loot, such as that messenger's gift we just picked up and will be checking out as soon as we get out of this poison swamp, there's also the fact that they drop pretty potent blood gems, cursed blood gems specifically. If you've forgotten, cursed blood gems provide higher bonuses relative to their tier of blood gem, and thus can be very nice for getting really good damage with your weapon. So at this point, if you haven't yet figured it out, the interesting design element to these crawlers here is the fact that there are tons of tiny little messengers sticking out on their underside. If you don't look very closely, you may just think they're gnarly teeth or something, but nope, they're messengers. And that's not the only place where messengers appear as part of an enemy's design. That's also the case with the Winter Lanterns as well. In their case, they have messengers sticking out of the top of their brain heads. Something else worth mentioning about their design is the fact that they're wearing the exact same clothes as the doll, and if you Google Bloodborne Winter Lantern doll, you can find a nice comparison image of that. I'll probably include that in the thread somewhere. As to what exactly that means, the fact that they share design elements with the doll and include messages as well, there are a couple different theories about that, but I won't go into them here just yet. At any rate, leaving that area brings us out to this big central swamp area that we avoided way back when, to instead head along that side path to the side area with the giant lost children. This area here is progress, but we haven't yet explored everything along that side path, so let's head back towards that way. Although, before we do just that, a quick trip into this little side cave here. This is where the sinister bell-ringing woman is, and we could kill her, and this would prevent us from being invaded at all, but let's not and hope for an invasion. Although, as I already mentioned, one does not happen, which was very disappointing, as invasions always spice up these games, but again, Bloodborne's invasion system is designed in such a way that they're not terribly likely to happen, especially if you're not summoning people, which is really unfortunate. Something Dark Souls 3 has improved on immensely, I will say. All that said, let's get back to talking about the Chikage. We've already talked about the untransform moveset, so let's talk about transforming the Chikage. Not the transform moveset or even the transforming attack, but just transforming it, because transforming this weapon actually is pretty unique. You transform it by sheathing the blade and covering it in your blood, but when you sheathe the blade, you actually gain a special new attack. Oh, also, just as a quick aside, this is the item that was laid to trap us, a Cold Blood Flower Bud, which is a Chalice Dungeon ritual item, and actually one that will come in handy in the future. But transforming the Chikage, as I mentioned, is interesting. When you sheath it, you can either just let it go and go into the transform moveset, or you can do an attack immediately from the sheath, an EI attack, as it's called. And these EI slashes are some of the most damaging attacks the Chikage has to offer, so you'll see people using them a lot. At any rate, the messenger's gift we picked up is another arcane hunter tool. This one disguising you as a messenger bearing a message. Not at all worthwhile in PvE, but it has some PvP use, letting you disguise yourself and let an invader run past, or if you're invading to potentially sneak up on an invader and get a backstab or something. A host, that is, not an invader. Another reason to come this way is the fact that you can get rid of that one giant lost child. One less pain in the ass to deal with in that swamp area. And an upgraded clockwise metamorphosis rune that we'll be slapping on next time we return to the dream. And forgive me here for being a bit bumbly with my traversal of the level. As I mentioned before, my memory of it isn't perfect at this point, so I'm bound to do some backtracking here or there, especially in this part here where it's pretty complex with all the paths strewn about. So we've discussed the untransform moveset and the unique transforming properties of the Chikage. So let's talk about the transform moveset, which is really where the Chikage shines above all else. Compared to the untransform moveset, the transform moveset trades speed for power. Its swings are considerably slower, although they are still very fast, definitely top tier in terms of speed, but they gain increased damage. In addition to the overall damage increase, the attack element of the Chikage changes from physical to blood, at which point it scales off of your blood tinge stat, and if you have equal skill and equal blood tinge, it will scale better with the blood tinge due to a higher scaling rating in S compared to a C or B in skill. This is why when leveling up, Blood Tinge did not increase the overall damage of the weapon, because it only shows the damage of the untransformed, the physical damage affected by your skill stat. The fact that the transform moveset has blood damage also creates an interesting interaction with certain enemy types, most notably the various types of dogs, and also the Canehurst servants. If you remember, these are enemies that are knocked to the floor by bullets, and that is not a special property unique to bullets, but instead to blood damage, and so the few weapons in the game that deal blood damage will do the same, and thus a single hit from the transformed Chikage will send them flying, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. It prevents you from stun locking them to death, but it can be handy if you just want to get them out of the fight while you fend off something else. In addition to being able to ragdoll some smaller enemies like that, the transformed Chikage is also excellent at stunning larger enemies due to how hard its hits hit. It's very good at breaking even larger enemies' hyper armor and stun locking them. Oh, something worthy of note here, a demo of the Augur of Abriatus. In addition to doing a decent amount of damage, it can actually stagger like a gunshot, and thus is a useful alternative to guns for any arcane-based characters. And interestingly enough, this wasn't always the case. In the base game, it just did damage, and then after several patches they added the ability to stagger with it. And it really does do a lot to make arcane builds considerably more viable. But yeah, last thing worthy of note about the transformed Chikage moveset is its heavy attacks, which drain your HP, and they drain a greater amount the longer you hold the attack. And thus, although its charged attacks are very powerful, especially the charged R2 into R2 combo as we saw against that Winter Lantern way back, it's not without cost. And that's really kind of the Chikage in a nutshell really. It's a very potent weapon, with a lot going for it, but with a much higher cost compared to other weapons, even more so than say the Tonitrus, with its low durability and high durability consumption. At any rate, let's continue on and make some actual progress in this area for once. Oh dear, that's not a good sign. Depending on how you go about exploring this level, this could very well be your first encounter with the Winter Lanterns. And this is probably one of the nastier first encounters you could have with one. Given that it's on a very small ledge, there's really not much you can do about the frenzy, about getting out of its line of sight. And thus, if this is your first encounter, you're probably gonna die to it. I've not seen many people actually survive their first encounter with this one. Pretty much the best way to go about it is to wait for it to turn around and walk away, so you can get as close as possible before it notices you, and then just take it out quickly. Being careful not to be grabbed, of course. Another large wandering nightmare. This one is a huge pain in the ass to get. It has a very good chance of knocking you off the edge with its knockback attacks. But it does drop a bloodstone chunk, which is very handy. A madman's knowledge next to a deep, dank pit. No thanks, game. We're not going to be going through that route. So, at this point, the rest of the level is pretty damn straightforward. There's not really anything new to encounter. So rather than talking about that, let's talk a bit about the plot and lore up to this point. Even if this is a bit out of nowhere. I plan at some point to do a more comprehensive lore video where I show relevant item descriptions and character dialogue and whatnot. But depending on my mood, I may not actually end up getting around to doing that. I'm a very lazy person. So in the off chance that I don't, I figure I'll start discussing the plot and lore in these videos here, piece by piece. So let's get started with the beginning. Of the player character arriving in Yharnam. As to why they would do that, short little aside, that is a very obvious boss arena, so we're not going there just yet. So the player character arriving in Yharnam. The exact reasons why aren't really stated, but it's not hard to come up with one, and in fact if you were watching like pre-release footage and press and stuff, it's actually even more obvious, they just outright say it there. But basically Yharnam is well known in the outside world for its healing blood. It's pretty much the Yharnam specialty, and people come from all over to imbibe this and have their diseases cured. And so it is likely that your character came to Yharnam for that very blood. This is further supported by the Blood Minister's dialogue at the beginning mentioning pale blood as if you had asked about it. So you clearly were searching for some type of healing blood. And as I mentioned in pre-release footage and press and whatnot, they pretty much just straight up said that your character comes to Yharnam for that healing blood, if I remember right. So that's why the player character came to Yharnam, but I don't believe they did so without a direct purpose, that they were just hoping to find someone willing to give them blood. And that is because of the Cainhurst invitation. If you remember, it said that it was rather bafflingly addressed to us, addressed to the player character. The way I see it, the player character was invited to Cainhurst by Annalise, perhaps being a distant descendant of the nobles from Cainhurst, and so stopped by in Yharnam along the way, where they then met with the Blood Minister, and the rest is history as we know it. Alternatively, the player character could have been coming to sell Annalise real estate. You get that reference? No? Okay. But either way, that's why you find the invite on the same table that you started the game on. After you received the blood infusion from the Blood Minister, you left the Yosefka's clinic, she barred the doors behind you, and your invitation was left behind. So at that point you leave the clinic and start exploring Yharnam proper, a place that is beset by a plague of beasts. And this is not the first beast plague that Yharnam has suffered, as old Yharnam is ample evidence of. At this point they're kind of used to it, but the common masses don't really know why it exists. And a lot of them, being quite xenophobic, think it is due to outsiders diluting the purity of their special blood, thus bringing about the beast plague. Whatever the cause may be, the beast plague is quite a bit of a bother, and it makes Yharnam difficult to explore, there not being very many friendly faces. That's when we happen upon Gilbert, an outsider like us who came to Yharnam for the special healing blood to cure a disease, and it worked. It gave him extra time that he would not otherwise had. He tells us that he doesn't really know much about their special healing blood, but that if anyone would, it would be a member of the Healing Church, the purveyors of their special healing blood. And so he tells us to seek out the Cathedral Ward, where the high residents of the church reside, and therein we would find our answers more likely than not. And so we travel through Yharnam, felling several dangerous beasts, such as the Cleric Beast and the poor deranged Father Gascoigne, and eventually make our way to the Cathedral Ward through Odin Chapel. We find our progress in the Cathedral Ward blocked by a gate, and so head down instead into Old Yharnam, burned and abandoned for a previous plague of beasts. Here we meet the old retired hunter Dura, who is tired of his duty to kill the beasts and now protects them, given that they are the transformed townfolk. Oh yeah, don't be hubristic, folks. That's pretty much entirely what caused this death here. Had I returned to the Hunter's Dream and restocked on blood vials, that really wouldn't have been nearly as big of an issue as it was. And in fact, there's nearly a second death here, as I run for the item and then just kind of book it out to the dream to actually restock. Continuing on talking about the story, an interesting thing about Deer is that when he kills you, he references the Hunter's Dream, indicating that you're not the only hunter that has been bound to the dream, at least across the entirety of time. If you read the item descriptions of the items that you get in Old Yharnam, such as the poison pellets, you find that the beast plague there was precipitated by an ashen blood plague, which is basically just poison. It's the reason why most of the beasts there poison you. The exact cause of the plague is unknown, but I will point out that the White Church Doctor set mentions that They believe that medicine is not a means of treatment, but rather a method for research, and some knowledge can only be obtained by exposing oneself to sickness. And that there are also the Black Church doctors who are established to look out for early signs of the beast plague and prevent it from spreading any further, so the Church clearly knows that the beast plague is an issue if nothing else. So that's about all we'll talk about the plot for now, because it's boss fight time. Say hello to Amygdala, or as that man pronounced it, Amygdala. This gives the gift of the Godhead comment that the man made a bit of context, given that the tonsil stone he gave us looks just like this thing's head. And in fact, the word amygdala is the Latin word for tonsil. This spicy little number takes virtually no damage from its torso or its legs, so you need to target either its arms or its head, which take normal and exceptionally huge damage, respectively. Actually, attacking its head can be a bit difficult due to the fact that it is rather high up. You have to wait for him to lower it after several attack combos. And that's why having a form of ranged attack makes this boss much easier. The Executioner's gloves do a pretty decent amount of damage and pretty excellent on an arcane character. But for other characters, a pistol will suffice. Bone Marrow Ash buffed anything will do ridiculous amounts of damage, and if it's the repeater pistol, which as I've gone over is one of the strongest pistols in the game, the strongest in terms of raw damage, it just kinda does a number on him. He's already at his second stage, and we haven't even been fighting him for that long. That's how much of a glaring weakness his head is if you can exploit it. In this second phase, he gets a few new attacks, such as these short consecutive laser bursts rather than a huge laser beam. And he gets these annoying gravity field black holes around his attack, which persist for an annoyingly long time. Get his HP low enough, and he goes into his third phase, where he did what he just did, which is pretty damn metal, I gotta say. This is actually a pretty huge buff for him, as it greatly increases his attack range and makes him much more dangerous. It makes it very difficult to approach him, which makes ranged attacks even more valuable in this phase of the fight. Yeah, remember what I mentioned about the weird black holes lasting for an annoyingly long time? That's what I mean. So let's settle this with a buffed pistol then. Thus we have made even a god our prey. We'll have to go and check back with that man at some point now that we've slain his worshipped god. But for now, I think that'll be it. We've had enough nightmares for today, so now it's time to get some sweet dreams. Good night, my dear hunters, and see you next time.